Before Giuseppe Morello, before Masseria and Maranzano fought the Castellsmmarese War, there was the Black Hand of New Orleans. Geopolitical whirlwinds, economic pressures, and mass migration. In the late 1860s, geopolitical and economic forces led to a great migration of Sicilians and southern Italians to the city of New Orleans. Back in Italy, while those in Rome and in the north enjoyed the fruits of modern industrialization, those in the south and in Sicily suffered under terrible conditions. The peasants were still essentially serfs, tied to the land and its owners. Immigrating via the Palermo to New Orleans shipping route became the only way to move beyond crushing poverty and subsistence living. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, the Civil War was over and freed slaves were leaving the South in droves, looking for more tolerant treatment and better employment opportunities. This meant the migration of freed slaves created a demand for labor in both agriculture and on the docks. Italian immigrants, mainly Sicilians, filled this gap in the labor force. It was among these hard-working immigrants that a young mafioso named Raffaele Agnello entered the United States through the port of New Orleans in 1860. From Palermo to Little Palermo, the rise and fall of Raffaele Agnello. Raffaele Agnello and his brother Joseph Peppino Agnello were already mafiosos of the Black Hand when they arrived in New Orleans from Palermo in 1860. They lived together in the 5th Ward of the city, located in the center of the French Quarter. The brothers quickly integrated themselves with their community, and when Mayor John T. Monroe created a local militia called the European Brigade, he made Raffaele Agnello its leader. A year later, when Confederate troops and local police pulled out of New Orleans, only the European Brigade remained to keep order in the city. Agnello would use this position of prominence in the brigade to consolidate power within the Italian immigrant community. In post-war New Orleans, Sicilian immigrants flooded the city. This both strengthened the Agnellos' numbers while simultaneously enlarging the community with which they preyed upon. By 1868, the Agnello brothers led one of the 3 largest gangs in the French Quarter. His primary rivals were the Messina gang from the east coast of Sicily and the largely Sicilian militia, the Innocenti. As the Agnello brothers began to consolidate their power in the Little Palermo section of New Orleans, conflicts began occurring between them and the Innocenti. It is believed that around this time Raffaele Agnello began plotting the murder of Pietro Barba, who was a leader in the New Orleans Little Messina colony and a ranking member of the Innocenti. On October 28, 1868, Joseph P. Machia, commander of the Innocenti Political Brigade, suspended its violent presidential election rally at the Orleans Ballroom on Bourbon and Orleans Street. Because of this, 27-year-old Pietro Barba found himself walking alone to his hospital street home. He would never make it. Barba was shot and killed on the corner of St. Philip and Chartres Street. Meanwhile, many of the Innocenti members gathered to honor Edward Malone, who was killed 2 nights earlier, and to celebrate the group's successful obstruction of French Quarter radical republicanism. When news of Barba's murder made it back to the Innocenti gathering, only the presence of U.S. troops prevented Innocenti commander Joseph Machisa from ordering his men back into the streets. The Agnellos attempted to place blame for the murder on a local African-American cigar maker and state politician, Octave Belleau. Belleau, however, came forward with an alibi. The Messinese, of which Barba was also a member, began to suspect the Agnellos. In order to try to calm the tension, Joseph Peppino Agnello held a large party at his Royal Street home. Present at the party was suspected shooter Alphonse Mateo. After many guests had left, Messinese leader Joseph Bonanno cornered Mateo and began to vigorously question him about the murder. Mateo then pulled a knife on Bonanno, who immediately pulled his gun, shooting Matteo in the face and killing him. The Agnellos then drew their guns and chased out the Messinese, wounding their leader Bonanno. The Sicilian Gang Wars of New Orleans. After the shooting, the Messinese quietly looked to return to business as usual, but the Agnellos would not have it. In the war that ensued, Joseph Machisa sided with the Messinese faction. However, many Sicilians within the Innocente left Machisa and sided with the Agnellos. On February 15, 1869, Joseph Agnello and his men stormed a home occupied by Joseph Bonanno and one of his men, Giovanni Casabianca, wounding them with shotguns before they escaped. It was clear Bonanno would not be safe in the city, so he and his people fled to Texas. Meanwhile, Joseph Machisa sued for peace, and a meeting was set up. While there is no record of what transpired at the meeting, what is known is that Raphael Agnello resumed his everyday affairs as if peace had been made. Then on April 1st, 1869, while out for a stroll, Raphael Agnello was shot and killed. The police had suspects, but due to omerta, Agnello's murder remained unsolved. Joseph Machisa now found himself in position to take control of the New Orleans underworld. He allied with the already powerful Salvatore Matranga and established his organization as paramount in the French Quarter. It was around this time when the typical Mafia structure began to be established by the organization. There was an administration of around 3 underbosses just below the commander or boss. Below these administrators was the capodecina, or captain, and each capodecina had at least 10 soldati doing the commander or boss's bidding. Machisa bankrolled the organization early on and oversaw many of its most lucrative rackets. However, it was Salvatore Matranga that held the respect of the soldati and capodecinas, and thus the real power in the organization. Machisa accepted this and embraced Matranga as the official boss of the family. Much of the New Orleans Sicilian colony viewed the Matranga organization in a positive light, and Matranga soon began to initiate new members. Just as today, members were recruited by invitation only, and refusing an invite was a severe breach of etiquette, and one that exposed the recruit to the most severe retribution. Murder of an enemy of the organization was almost always the last rite of passage for a recruit. Matranga and Machisa found themselves tying up loose ends, and in April of 1872, Joseph Marisa, a Matranga associate, shot Joseph Agnello in the chest as he attempted to flee. After his death, the remaining Agnello crew disbanded and scattered. Salvatore Matranga and his underboss, Joseph Machisa, would dominate the New Orleans underworld for more than a decade until a new group would rise up to challenge them. During the 1870s and early 1880s, the Matranga organization ran extortion rackets throughout the city. This included extracting payments from the Provenzano family who controlled the docks. As the Provenzano organization, led by family patriarch Joe Provenzano, grew in size and power, they decided to challenge Matranga control. Once again, war broke out. As bodies piled up on both sides, the city's non-Italian residents were growing less and less tolerant of the Italian immigrant community and the violence associated with it. The New Orleans Times wrote, "Parts of the city have been overrun by well-known and notorious murderers, counterfeiters, and burglars who have formed a sort of co-partnership or stock company for the plunder and disturbance of the city." To deal with the problem, the city appointed 29-year-old David Hennessy to the position of New Orleans police chief. Hennessy already had an impressive record in dealing with organized crime, having captured the notorious criminal Giuseppe Vincent Rebelo Esposito, who was wanted in Italy for kidnapping and cutting the ear off of a British tourist. In the beginning, Hennessy made progress mediating the war between the two factions. However, that all changed on the night of October 15, 1890. That night, on the way home, David Hennessy was shot and died at the hospital the next day. Before he succumbed to his wounds, he blamed the attack on the Sicilians. Mass hysteria swept the city and more than 250 Italians were rounded up for questioning. Ultimately, 19 of these men were charged either with murder or as an accessory, and all were held without bail. One of the 19 happened to be Joseph Machisa. Then, however, in a shocking development, not a single one of the 19 were convicted. When word of the verdict came down, an angry mob stormed the jail, and 11 of the 19 were either lynched or shot. One of those killed was Joseph Machisa. Some believe this to be the largest single mass lynching in history. Matranga was able to escape from the vigilante lynchings by leaving the city. When he returned, he was able to retake his place as the boss of the New Orleans crime family. Over the next few years, the Matranga organization would put continuing pressure on the Provenzanos, slowly encroaching on both their rackets and their territory, eventually pushing them out of New Orleans entirely. This left Matranga's New Orleans crime family as the dominant power in the New Orleans underworld. The modernization of the Mafia and the rise of Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo. Matranga would rule the family into old age until shortly after the beginning of Prohibition. At that time, he would peacefully hand over the reins of the family to up-and-coming Lieutenant Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carollo. Carollo was born in Sicily and immigrated to New Orleans with his parents in 1904. By 1918, Carollo had become a high-ranking capo for Matranga. Carollo would succeed Matranga as boss in 1922. Assuming control of Matranga's minor bootlegging operation, Silver Dollar Sam, as he became known, waged war against the other bootlegging operations in the city. Following the murder of William Bailey, who was the last independent bootlegger standing, Carollo would control all major bootlegging operations in New Orleans. With Prohibition came political corruption, and Silver Dollar Sam had the connections. He wasn't afraid to use them either. When Al Capone personally traveled to New Orleans and demanded Carollo supply him, rather than his rival Joe Aiello, with high-end imported alcohol, Carollo met them at the train station with a cadre of police officers who disarmed Capone's bodyguards, breaking fingers in the process. He then forced Capone to take the returning train to Chicago. It wasn't all roses between Carollo and the feds, however. In 1930, he was arrested for shooting undercover narcotics agent Cecil Moore during an undercover drug buy. Despite support from several New Orleans police officers who testified that Carollo was in New York at the time of the murder, he was still convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Released in 1934, Carollo negotiated a deal between New York mobsters Frank Costello and Philip Castell, as well as Louisiana Governor Huey the Kingfish Long, to bring slot machines into Louisiana, after which Carollo and underboss Carlos Marcello would run illegal gambling operations undisturbed for several years. Carollo would run into problems again in 1938, however, when he was arrested on narcotics charges. At this point, the government was attempting to deport him. However, the country's entrance into World War II delayed those proceedings. In an effort to remain in the United States, Carollo struck a deal with U.S. Congressman Jimmy Morrison, who would propose a bill in Congress granting Carollo citizenship and thus quashing all deportation proceedings. However, investigative reporter Drew Pearson would expose the plot, and Silver Dollar Sam Carollo would be deported in 1947. Carlos the Little Man Marcello would take over as the New Orleans crime family boss and would lead them through a number of controversies and conspiracies, the most notable being his possible involvement with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He would avoid prison time for most of his life, however, and controlled the New Orleans underworld for the better part of 35 years. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe below.